TBL is a pretty well-established pedagogical design, but for those who are not familiar with it, I tend to describe it as kind of extreme flipping. It is flipping the entire course along a particular structure. So this isn't something that you can adopt necessarily for just one class or part of a class, like think, pair, share. It's setting up the entire course from beginning to end along the team structure. And the teams are permanent. Students work with the same 5 to 7 students for the entire course of the semester. At the beginning, students are given pre-class preparation assignments, and in my course it was readings, but it would be in a lot of classes watching videos. It's essentially the information transfer stage, right? The content acquisition stage that students do on their own. The very first class meeting of the modules, students come into class and they take a test, an exam, an assessment on what they were supposed to do before class. First they do it individually, and then as soon as they're done with their individual test, they immediately retake the same test with their team. And there's a process for doing that alleviates some of the concerns one might have about having students do team tests. But that team test is really key for a couple of reasons. One, it's a strong accountability and incentive mechanism for students. I don't know how many times students have said that if it was just their grade writing on it, they would have flaked out on the homework, but because they knew their team was relying on them, they knew they had to be prepared. The other huge benefit in this particular part of the process is that by the time they're done with the team test, they have clarified for each other any questions that they still have about that material that they were supposed to have, that basic content. The last stage is me doing some clarifying instruction. I do a mini lecture. This really is the only sort of prepared lecture that I do the entire semester, is maybe 10 minutes at the end of that first class. And even that is more of a Q&A, because I really am asking them, now that you've gone through all this stuff and gone through the assessment, what questions do you still need answered? What do you still need additional explanation about? And I have a pretty good idea of what those things are going to be, so that's the prepared part. But it also is mostly in the context of answering questions that they have about specific concepts. That generally takes most of the first day of the module, and as I said, my modules were anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. So the rest of the class meetings for the rest of those 2 to 4 weeks is spent entirely on team application exercises. And in a lot of classes, these would look similar maybe to what you might now assign as problem sets, the take-home exercises that students do on their own. But instead, my students work on them in teams in class. I also do assign them homework for each one of those days, class meetings, and that also is mostly preparatory work for what we're going to do in class. So, for example, I would have them go to a website where they get some data and they have to manipulate it in Excel. They have to calculate the mean and the median and the variance. And I make sure they do that by having them do pre-class quizzes in Blackboard, which is our learning management system. These are quizzes that they can take as many times as they want. So the main purpose is to make sure that they did the pre-class work. As I tell the students, it's free points, right? There's no reason you shouldn't get 100% of the points on those pre-class quizzes, because they can go back and do them as many times as they need to. When they submit, they're told if their answer is right or wrong, and which questions they got right and wrong, and they can go back and do it. And they learn that that's important, because when they get to class, I'm not going to spend any time talking about how they should have gotten the mean or how they should have gotten those statistics or what the definitions of the variables are that they should have done before class. Instead, I ask them a question. In this case, I might say it's a scenario where they're going to be reporting on the average of some population. Should you use the mean or the median, right? Which is the appropriate measure to use? That's a much more complex, higher order kind of process, and they have a huge debate within their team. What are the pros and cons of using each one of those statistics? Like with any other sort of flipped class, the idea is that what we used to do in lecture, where we would give the content and students would get the basic concepts, is now done outside of class, and I don't have to do any of that. And so in-class time is now spent on the much more interesting, complex stuff that they want help with. right? And so we can spend time on that in class. So I also mentioned that this is an upper division course, and there are some benefits and challenges to that. One of the unequivocal benefits I find, particularly with the class I teach, is I can actually enforce my prerequisites. My students have already taken 101 and 102. They've taken a lower division statistics class. We've all taught upper division classes where there are things students are supposed to know from it because presumably they passed 101 and 102 already. And yet we spend time reviewing a lot of information we think they should know, right? I don't do that in my class because I push it into the pre-class prep. I remind them, you guys did take these classes, you passed them, at least your transcript says you passed them. So the knowledge is there in your brain somewhere. I'm not going to spend class time on it. You need to go retrieve that. It will be on the readiness assurance test on the first day of the module. And I give them lots of guidance on what they need to review. But I don't have to do any of it. And so, again, that's something that frees up class time for more interesting things. Another benefit of the upper division class is that you are working with more mature students. I think that a lot of instructors are hesitant about flipping their courses because it does require your students to take more responsibility for their own education. And to a certain extent, I think upper division students are more ready for that and willing and even wanting it. I've had many students tell me, they feel like this is the first time they actually get to use economics and do it. There is a flip side to that I'll come back to in a second. And then another big benefit of flipping an upper division class is that coming up with the stuff to do in class, coming up with the applications and the higher order things that you want students to be really working on, should be a lot, in some ways, easier with an upper division class, right? Most of us, we're either teaching our specialties or we're teaching courses that are themselves applications of the core models students got in either principles or their intermediate theory courses. Right? So in some ways, thinking about what you want students to work on and that requires class time and your help with is actually in some ways easier with an upper division class. Those last 2 points I think of as being sort of double-edged swords though. With the maturity of your students also comes kind of, I think, a different type of student resistance. I have, I think, fewer students resistant to the structure in general because they're older and more mature, but the resistance I get takes the form of, I've always done well in my econ classes that are all lecture, and I'm used to that and I know how it works and I don't see why I should have to do it this different way. I don't get too many students who do it, but it's not freshmen. You can maybe convince them this is college; it's all going to be different, and you gotta work harder in general. Juniors and seniors aren't going to buy that argument, right? They've already sat through plenty of lecture classes. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but I was going to show you the exercise I do on the very first day of class, which is asking students themselves to think about what is important about their education, what they want to get out of it. But more importantly, I ask them, what is easier for you to do on your own versus what do you want help with? Acquiring information, learning to use information, and developing lifelong learning skills. All of my classes unanimously agree that acquiring information is the easiest thing to do on their own outside of class. And given the choice, they would love to have the help of their classmates and their professor on the more complex applications and skill building stuff. Right? Once I've gotten them to establish that, explaining why I structure the course the way I do is pretty easy, and they get it. And so that takes care of a lot of the resistance that students might otherwise have. But what I really wanted to spend a little more time on was talking about the challenges associated with the fact that upper division content is more complex. On the one hand, I think it's easier to come up with the exercises you want to work on in class because it is more relevant and applied and all of those things. At the same time, we usually, with principles classes, it may be a little easier to think about what do you push outside of class, right? There's lots of definitions and basic vocabulary that students have to acquire. In the upper division class, it all seems important, and it all seems complicated and more difficult for students to grasp. We all know that we can personally lecture on something for half an hour and be really clear and organized, and it all makes sense, and then, of course, half the students don't understand it. Here is where I think the approach that one takes to designing a flipped course can be really key. And I designed my course essentially from scratch. It wasn't intended to be that way. The person who taught it before me was doing something really weird, and I had to just redo the whole thing. So I use something called backward course design, which, kind of the way it sounds, you start with where you want to end up. And the 3 stages of backward course design, the way it's usually described, is you start out thinking about what do you want students to learn? What are your learning objectives? What do you want them to walk away with at the end of the semester? Given that, what evidence will you need from your students to know that they learned what you wanted them to learn? Given that, what intermediate steps do they need to go through in order to be able to create that evidence? That last step is where we want to think about what we're doing in class and what we can do outside of class. But it really starts with the learning objectives and outcomes. And in particular with a flipped class, I think that thinking about your learning objectives and evidence together can be useful, because you want to think about your learning outcomes in terms of higher order actions. And that means not just what do you want students to know or to understand, but what do you want them to do with that knowledge or with that understanding. And so thinking about what you want students to be able to do at the end of your class, at the end of your course, starts with phrasing your learning outcomes in terms of these actions. Right? The example I always use is that in my public finance class, it was great for students to know what a kinked budget constraint is, or how to draw one, or what one looks like, but that doesn't mean a lot if they don't know how to use it, right? So I want them to be able to use it to explain why someone would rather have a cash transfer or an in-kind transfer benefit policy versus something else, right? That kind of thing. And I wanted to end on a somewhat positive note, so this is kind of going back to why I do what I do. And these are both quotes just pulled from the student evaluations at the end of my course, but the one I really love is the first one. In other classes, I only listen to what the professor is saying without actually thinking about it. This approach also made me understand the material in a deeper manner. So I think it's with the flipped structure in particular, it's key to understand that what you're doing in class is helping students understand what they were getting through the videos or whatever before class. The whole point is that the doing in class and the actual working with the material is what really deepens their understanding and is the learning taking place.